Sacrifices of all kinds constitute the majority of our interactions with the gods from birth to death, but most of us don't have access to animal offerings, which are the first kind that comes to mind when someone thinks about the word sacrifice, and as I covered briefly in the previous video on how offerings were done, those sorts of sacrifices didn't even make up the bulk of ancient offerings given by any individual in their lifetimes. So what did? Let's take a look at what offerings to give the gods in Hellenism. Kairete. There were a wide breadth of ancient offerings given in ancient times, from the smokeless performances by bards and poets to animals slaughtered and feasted on in ancient sanctuaries to the first fruits of the garden and incense given in home hearths and braziers to votives left in temples and displayed until they were so damaged they would be placed in pits and storehouses on temple grounds still belonging to the gods. This video will be divided into 4 parts. The first concerns animal sacrifice and why the majority of modern Hellenists probably shouldn't try to engage with it. The second deals with perishable offerings like vegetal offerings, incense, and foodstuffs cooked for the gods and offered. The third deals with votive offerings, and the fourth with devotional or action offerings. No video on YouTube could have a reasonable length and get into every single thing that the ancients or modern people could ever offer to the gods, and I also know that there are many things that exist in the modern day that the ancients would never have access to. My advice would be to divine on offerings you'd like to present that aren't traditional and think through what categories they might fit into. For example, corn is from the Americas but would probably go to Demeter like other grains. I might comment on other items that are commonly found in many households for folks in the largest portions of my audience from time to time, but remember that your practice is yours, and that as I can't possibly cover every single thing, it will be important to explore and experiment on your own as well. That said, for more broad information on traditional offerings well-sourced and coherently organized, I highly suggest theoi.com, as they cover the majority of the gods we know of, including many local deities not as well covered by easily accessible sources. With that out of the way, let's get into offerings. Part 1. Animal offerings are probably a no-go. What is more iconic in the average person's mind when they think of pagan relationships of the gods than animal sacrifice? Many polytheistic traditions, such as Voodoo and Santeria, still practice animal sacrifice to this day, so the arguments here aren't moral against the practice as a whole. Rather, when talking about Hellenism specifically, and potentially more broadly many related reconstructed traditions, the hurdles we face as modern worshippers may be too difficult to overcome to bring this practice back. Nor is it necessary to do so, as in ancient times, there's strong evidence that the majority of sacrifices the average Greek, even a farmer, would give over their lifetime would be vegetal sacrifices of incense and burn food offerings from their gardens and fields. In order to get into why animal sacrifice isn't particularly practical in the modern day for Hellenists, we first need to get into how it was done, where, and why. There were numerous specifics around animal sacrifice, which gods would accept which victims and at what times, the majority of which weren't really written about, though we can take some guesses from the archaeological evidence when it's preserved, as well as from the written records of specifically communal festival sacrifices and those paid for by the city-state. The trouble we get into at the very first stage, choosing a sacrificial victim, is that our knowledge of what victims were given under what circumstances to which gods is severely limited by these constraints. These things were considered either common knowledge in their local areas or passed down orally, or were considered priestly knowledge in the case of cults performed by priests exclusively and have since been lost. What we do know tends to come in generalities. Hecate frequently took sacrifices of dogs, particularly black female dogs in Ionia, though they were generally considered sacred to her, and remains of dogs have been found in caves known to be her cult sites all around Greece. Cattle were frequently offered to Zeus and Athena, specifically oxen, though sometimes dogs, wild goats, and horses were also offered to Zeus according to A.B. Cook in his epic monograph on the cult of Zeus. Demeter largely demanded pregnant animals, usually sows, as they were sacred to her. The standards of Kala applied to the embryo inside the sow as well as the sow herself, and we'll get into those standards in a moment. Dionysos frequently received offerings of goats and bulls, and Poseidon frequently received offerings of all black bulls, sometimes burned burned at altars and sometimes bound and drowned in the sea. Artemis frequently received sacrifices of goats for her festivals, as many as 300 during one such Athenian rite. In Achaia, there was also a festival where many wild animals, such as deer, boars, bear cubs, and wild edible birds, were heaped alive onto a bonfire and sacrificed, though Pausanias notes that it was a specific rite to that area. I could get deeper into other gods and offerings they would receive that we know of for different occasions, but suffice to say that the specifics of who got what and when were particular, heavily tracked, and were considered important for the average worshipper to know. Having lost so many of them, it would be difficult to reproduce the majority of these sacrificial rites in the modern day without setting up other offices for specific Hellenist local communities to ask the gods what they would like and when, or without epiphanies to either restore or create new knowledge of sacrifices and festivities for these modern communities. We've just lost so much about the context of these sacrifices and their frequency, and it's a daunting task to begin with. These animals, as mentioned, had to be kalos or kala, meaning absolutely perfect. We see numerous references to the necessity of perfection of the sacrifices, and that the very best animals of every herd were given to the gods throughout the Iliad, Odyssey, and several plays, such as the reference in Aristophanes' Acarnanians, when Decaeopolis is arguing with Megarion about a young sow regarding whether or not it would be acceptable for Demeter. Decaeopolis points out that the pig has no tail, which means it can't be sacrificed. Scarred, injured, maimed, or mutated animals had no place on sacrificial altars. This is a big part of why I tend to discourage offering modern meat from the supermarket to the gods. Although one could make the case that offerings were often purchased by the upper class in cities at sanctuaries, so purchasing the meat isn't as much of an issue, the animals purchased were typically raised and purified at sanctuary lands belonging to the god and managed by the temple. Thereby, the animals were guaranteed to be perfect. A quick and very unpleasant Google search will show the conditions which most animals raised for food in the modern day are raised in are less than ideal. Trigger warning, I'm gonna show some unpleasant stuff. No images of slaughter, but images of deformed and maimed animals. You might want to look away if you'd rather just hear these things described rather than see them. Pigs often chew one another's tails off out of boredom, leading to the practice of cutting those tails at a young age to prevent this. Likewise with sawing chicken beaks to prevent idle pecking of one another out of boredom, the list goes on. The point is, you can't see the animal the meat came from unless you went to the farm and bought it whole, so you really can't tell whether the gods would accept said meat or not. Besides that, the portions usually offered to the gods were the thigh bones and fat, which in the modern day don't even make it to the supermarkets and are difficult to get at butchers unless you know the butcher. Even then, there are hints in some writings of potential rituals that were performed to make these animals hiera, or holy, at the sanctuaries where many sacrificial animals were raised. Hints only, we have no real remaining evidence of what these rituals were, who performed them, and what they would entail. For community festivals, groups of 1,000 worshippers in districts surrounding the city-states would hold beauty contests of their flocks, and only the most beautiful animals would be decorated and set off to the festival sites for sacrifice. The sheer number of animals that must have been entered into these beauty contests to select only the best of the best for the community would have been staggering. Can you imagine modern Hellenist communities getting large enough to ensure the animals would not only be perfect, but the best that can be offered? Given how different the modern relationship the average person has to their meat and animals is from the average ancient, it seems like a difficult proposition at best. The way animals acted when led up to the slaughter also affected the outcome of a ritual. A certain kind of bellowing from cattle, described by Lucian as half-voiced like the sound of a flute, was considered to be a good sign. Animals trembling while standing at the altar was considered a sign of consent, as was nodding. And animals also had to have a good appetite leading up to their sacrifice to prove that they were in good health. If an animal struggled too much being led up, it could be interpreted as a sign of ill omen, and another would need to be selected. Likewise, if the animal tried to eat from sacred bows being carried in procession with it. Many of these sorts of tests and prohibitions have also been lost, making reconstruction difficult though not impossible. After all these tests, once the animal was slaughtered, its innards must then be examined to see if they too are perfect, particularly the liver, which had various divinatory connotations that would be read by Montes, but also the intestines and other innards. If the innards were in some way malformed or misplaced, as it's common knowledge to surgeons that the inside of the body is often not as well organized as the outside, and sometimes things aren't where they're supposed to be, then the sacrifice would be rejected by the god and a new sacrifice would need to be ordered. Given that modern animals are often raised in conditions where they're fed diets not well suited to their biology, as in the past, diseases such as enlarged hearts or damaged internal organs abound among animals raised for meat. This is especially an issue in chickens, which have been selectively bred so heavily for their large breasts that many of them can't even stand fully up by the time they go to slaughter. Their internal organs can be crushed by the meat of their massive muscles, and quite frequently a number of them don't even get to slaughter due to the pressure being put on their systems by by this cruel selective breeding by humans. These animals certainly wouldn't be internally kalos, nor would the omens from their stressed organs be particularly positive. Okay, you ask, but what if I get my hands on one of the other variants and raise it myself on my own lands? I suppose you could, though let's face it, the majority of us wouldn't be able to do something like that, and I doubt that there would be enough demand in a local area for someone to sustain a sanctuary for this purpose. A farmer who was a pagan could potentially fulfill all of the above requirements and raise kalos animals for sacrifice by pagans, but let me ask you, with all the dreams of temples and sanctuary sites that many pagans have had for upwards of 50 years, why is it that we haven't seen very many succeed for any length of time? In ancient times, there were entire cultures devoted to these gods, and maintenance of temples and sanctuary sites were a collective cultural affair that was ensured by the governments of those city-states. We have no such body in the modern day, nor should we, and if one were attempted to start up, there would likely not be enough funding or demand to maintain it. Given the sheer amount of knowledge we've lost, although it is possible for some of that knowledge to be restored through divine experiences and divination, the fact remains that animal sacrifice without this guidance in the modern day would be risky, and it's just generally impractical with the knowledge we do have remaining from ancient times and how particular the gods are about their animal offerings. Beyond this, the majority of sacrifices given in ancient times weren't animals, at least on the individual level. The average Greek would have given far more vegetal and votive offerings throughout the course of their lifetime. Part 2. Vegetal Offerings. By vegetal here, I mean offerings that came completely from plants, so think incense, libations of items like wine, garden produce, etc. The majority of ancient offerings given by any individual Greek would have been of this type, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. The agricultural economy of any city-state likely couldn't afford to lose a substantial number of animals on a regular basis. According to F.S. Knighton in Smoke Signals for the Gods, the evidence from ancient home sites suggests that largely animal sacrifices were communal and done at temples, and that by the classical age and later, if they were done at home, we don't have a lot of evidence for it. What we do have, however, is a great deal of written evidence regarding regular vegetal sacrifices. As I referenced in the video on how to sacrifice to the gods, Hesiod in Works and Days prescribes daily libations and the sprinkling of incense on the hearth fire. Incense, particularly frankincense, which was so ubiquitous many ancient authors simply called it incense and only specified when the resins they were talking about were of other types, was frequently kept in bags near the hearth for these daily rituals. The pouring of the wine into the fire was meant to create smoke, though sometimes libations were poured onto the ground in the epics when the heroes in question weren't near fires, suggesting that libations didn't always require a fire to be accepted. One of the most common types of offerings given in both temples and during festivals was various sorts of offering cakes. I say cakes loosely here, as many of these harder pucks don't have the spongy, soft connotations that we associate with the word today. I'll name off a few of these and describe them, though note that there are a lot more than I was able to get into. Kaluba were small, coin-sized wheat cakes that were used during ceremonies welcoming new members into the household, as in the case with a birth or the acquisition of a servant. This ceremony showered the new household member with nibbles, which included these cakes, figs, and nuts. They were also given as offerings to Zeus, Demeter, and Kore. Popanon, or large, flat pound cakes with a central large knob, were offered to Artemis, Leto, Heracles, Chrotrophos, and Hermes. According to Brumfeld in a paper published in Hesperia, these cakes were most often made with a whole pound of flour when given to these gods, though they'd be made with 2 pounds of flour when offered to Zeus or the Anemoi. Multiple knobbed pound cakes, sometimes with 5 but usually with around 12 knobs, called popana dodecaphala, were offered to Artemis, Zeus Georgos, or Zeus the farmer, Poseidon, the Anemoi, and Kronos. The plakos was apparently a light, fluffy cake more akin to those we'd be familiar with today. Its appearance was described as similar to a mallow seed, thick and scored down the edges, and it was made with an external cake shell containing honey and goat's milk cheese alternating with layers of pastry dough. These cakes were given as offerings during the Eleusinian Mysteries, and according to records at one temple, to Apollon as well. A similar kind of cake, called a phthoi, was made by taking farmer's cheese, extracting as much moisture as possible from it, grating it, straining it through a sieve, then mixing it with honey and a cup of wheat flour. These cakes were baked like the plakos and were frequently offered to Hestia, Zeus, Apollon, and Asclepios. An interesting offering, matzah, was first mentioned by Hesiod in Works and Days, consisted of grains, particularly emmer wheat and barley, ground and mixed with milk and then dried in the sun to form trakanas. This was one of the ways that the ancients stored milk for the winter, and the resulting dried substance ingredients was cooked in water to make a sort of gruel or porridge in the winter. Different kinds of matzah were used for different purposes. Basunia, which was made out of boiled wheat, honey, and a fig and walnuts, was offered to Iris, and umpai, wheat soaked in honey, was burned in fire offerings for Demeter. Sesamis were spherical cakes made of roasted sesame, honey, and oil. They were offered in mystery rites to Dionysos, Gaia, Demeter, Hecate, and Persephone. Palathion or palathe were fruit or nut cakes compressed with honey and were offered to Demeter and Kore in the Eleusinian mysteries. Also, animal-shaped cakes were frequently baked by poor folks to give the gods at temples instead of animal offerings, or were given at festivals by city-states to various deities. The bous, an offering cake decorated with horns, was said to represent either the new moon or an ox, and was given to Apollon, Artemis, Hecate, Selene, Demeter, and Kronos. One could extrapolate from here that modern offering cakes could be used to replace animal offerings in the modern day for folks still interested in offering something that would have been historically attested and still carries the effort of baking and creating. I won't bore you all too much with the extrapolated recipes for all these different kinds of cakes, nor is this list extensive. It's just a small sampling of the various kinds of prepared baked goods the ancient offered. You can find modern recipes for some of these by googling the name of the offering cake. Various blogs will come up with modern versions of the ancient recipes, created either from similar modern foods or from scholarly translations and descriptions of the ancient foodstuffs. Some of them were offered along with what was known as Aliakai, or first fruits offerings, effectively yields from the agricultural season from the very first plants that were yielding. If you had a garden or frequent farmers markets, you can determine what first fruits in your area might look like and offer some during the ancient festival days if you so choose. I personally burn the first yields of all the plants I grow to Demeter during the summer months as a thank you for the bountiful harvest to come. First fruits in ancient times also often included the first shearing wool from sheep, so for folks who spin their own yarn out there, consider offering some of what you'd use to the gods from time to time. Libations were many and varied in ancient times. We've discovered various offering vessels at different cult sites containing traces of milk, honey, wine, and oil. We know that a drink was made to break the fast of the Eleusinian prospective misti by mixing barley meal with water in ancient times, though some authors argue that pennyroyal was also included. I wouldn't recommend adding it in the modern day, as we know that it contains toxic properties and there isn't really a way to ingest it safely. Honey libations were frequently given to the nymphs Pan and the muses along with Demeter and Persephone. Libations of wine were given to dang near every god except Demeter, who in the Homeric hymn explicitly declines wine as is the custom. Libations of olive oil were also given to Athena, though many other gods would accept them as well. In terms of incense, the Orphic hymns often specify offerings of incense to various gods to accompany their performance. The resin styrax was often given to Zeus, Kronos, Dionysos, Proteus, Demeter, Semele, Hermes Chthonios, and the Charites. Myrrh was given to Poseidon, the Nephelai, Leto, Protegena, and Nereus. Frankincense was given to nearly every god in ancient times generally, and is a good all-purpose resin for offering daily if you're not entirely sure which incense you should give to the god in question. Beans and other pulses, vegetables, and grains of all kinds, and preparations of such were also frequently given as offerings throughout the year in both homes and during festivals. You can dig through websites like Theoi.com and JStore to find traditional offerings for various gods, though it's known that a bean and barley stew was offered to Apollon on the 7th of each lunar month and was also prepared at certain festivals to him. When thinking about modern food offerings, consider the meaning of the offering to you as well as what kinds of offerings might have been given to the gods in ancient times. Certain foods like corn were not available back then, but if you consider corn's nature as a grain, it's clear that grain offerings were frequently given to Demeter and Persephone, and that cooked items from corn, such as cornbread, might resemble ancient cakes given to some gods in ancient times could be used as comparable examples. When trying to figure out if a modern food offering is acceptable, don't hesitate to divine on said offering with either an ancient or a modern divination technique to confirm the gods are okay with it. I've rarely had offerings rejected on the basis of them being quote-unquote too modern, and not the same as ancient foodstuffs that the Greeks would have been feasted on. There's no way that I could catalog every kind of food offering ever given in ancient times, even if I tried, so don't hesitate to do your own research and find additional offering ideas. I typically offer daily libations of a good quality wine, first fruits of my garden during the appropriate season, libations of olive oil for Athena, and incense of various sorts to many different gods daily. The next kind of offering, votive offerings, I give much more sparingly, though I do pick them up or make them during special occasions. Part 3. Votive Offerings. Imagine with me for a moment, you walk into an ancient temple. You might initially picture the bare marble and humongous statues, maybe with a few lit oil lamps and some priests or priestesses milling about caring for them. But this is colored by the modern ruins you'd see at them if you visited them today. In reality, what would greet you would be thousands upon thousands of tiny statuettes, woven fabrics, baked goods, weapons and armor, even used and soiled bandages, furniture, and other gifts. You kneel down and take a look at one small statuette, say of Athena, and the inscription on it thanks her for the lessons of wisdoms the giver received regarding the loss of a friend. A small collection of armed soldiers thanks her for the strategy given by a general that led a recent regiment to victory. A beautiful tapestry proclaims her might as Ergani and thanks her for the artist's finest work. You, surrounded by a multitude of gifts, all representing moments of thanksgiving from thousands in your city-state, lay down your statuette, unable to doubt the sheer influence and might of the gods. Votive offerings comprise a large part of most museum exhibits and other displays of ancient Greek art and culture. I'm going to be referencing some pretty old books and studies for this section, as the most comprehensive work ever done on the topic was done way back in 1903. This means it's not exactly the most friendly to the polytheist perspective, as many older works of scholarship are. Check out my video on bias and scholarship for how to handle studies like it when you do your own research. What is a votive offering, you ask? It's anything that isn't perishable, animal or vegetal directly. Vegetal in this case, including incense as well as food offerings. An example of a votive offering might be the peplos woven for Athena every year for the Athenian New Year festivals. Link is in the iCard if you missed the video I did on them, or a small terracotta statue of the goddess herself presented at her shrine. So many of these offerings were given that temples kept them in large storerooms and would regularly melt down the metal offerings to give more beautiful or valuable metal votives. And they would store ancient terracotta and other votives in storerooms until they literally fell apart, as caring for the property of the gods was one of the main jobs given to the priestly temple staff. According to Arthur Cook in his paper Greek Votive Offerings, there were two main types of votive offerings. The first were material items which were given for their own value. These things include, in his word, things a god might need if they were a person, such as furniture, temple grounds, clothing, etc., as well as precious objects such as manufactured goods, ingots, coins, and akrotinia, which are items that are particularly rare or precious to the individual giving them. The second type were idealized offerings, which were given for what they were implied to be. These are more symbolic offerings, and we need to dig a bit to understand their significance. Sometimes these things are fairly simple bits of symbolism, such as miniature copies of the Artemis and Fawn statues found in Corcyra. Others are a little more complex, representing the power of a deity. The example Cook gives is a small statue of Heracles with his club and lion skin, or Apollon seated on the oracular tripod on a relief at the Athenian Pythium. A human act of some kind committed by the city-state might be portrayed as being blessed by a god. His example here was given from Pausanias, where the people of Heraclea Pontica defeated the Mariadni and sent a group of offerings representing the labors of Heracles. Other examples included an anatomical model of a particular body part healed given to a god's shrine, figures of Zeus and Hera seated together as bridegroom and bride from Samos thought to commemorate weddings, and depictions of sacrifices, libations, prayers, dances, and feasts. Sometimes votives either were or depicted a prize won by an action that was symbolized by the god. Examples include the spoils of war or representations of them, such as a bronze group of horses and captive women sent to Olympia by the Tarentines after a victory over the Messippians, prizes won in games and musical contests, crowns of honor awarded to city-states of individuals, and choice samples of the works of craftsmen. The implements with which great success had been attained might also be given as votive offerings. Aristomenes, who put flight to an entire Spartan regiment, dedicated his shield to Trophonius at Lebadea, according to Pausanias. Models of these items could be given in their stead as well, such as a golden anvil found at Delos. Similar to the example I gave earlier of models of healed body parts, sometimes things like bandages no longer needed due to wounds healed by the god would be given as votives. I'll be honest, when I first read this description when I worked on the video the first time, it actually led me to tears. The fact that somebody was so grateful that they took these old bandages and thought that it was so significant they should give it as an offering to Asclepios and Apollon, just something about that was so humanizing and beautiful that I just lost it a little bit. I don't know how to describe it other than that. Hopefully you all don't think that's silly that I noted this here, but it was something that was really, really impactful to me at the time. Because when you think about all of these examples of votive offerings, every single one of these very clearly represented something incredibly important to the people who gave it. Not just on a city-state level as in the example of some of these larger offerings, but on such a personal and intimate level in the case of these bandages. Anyhow, let's get back to what we were talking about. Clothing worn at a critical time in someone's life might also be given as votives. Examples given here include a breastband given to Aphrodite and the robes of the Eleusinian priests. Keep in mind, this was during a time when all clothing had to be woven by hand, so most folks didn't have a lot, and fabric, cloth, and wool were very expensive. This was a pretty significant offering. Allegorical offerings also fall into this last category. Statues that personified concepts such as victory, luck, vengeance, etc., as well as groupings that represented ideas such as Athens conquering the Eastern powers, were given as offerings to the temples. The majority of the example offerings contained inscriptions or designations of some kind indicating who gave them to the god, what the god they were given to, and for what purpose. This was important as offerings of these sorts were considered at once public and private. It was important for the polis at large to know who gave these offerings, especially the larger scale ones given by the tyrants in the early days, such as the massive statue of Apollon that the Naxians set up for Athena on the Acropolis. For those without a lot of money to spend, even small votives with these sorts of dedications showed that they were doing their best to honor the deity that helped them. Quite often, votive offerings were either commissioned in the case of more wealthy folks or purchased from vendors and markets. Very small statues of various gods in terracotta and bronze have been found all over Greece, usually copies of the cult statue from the temple itself, often near identical to one another. Some scholars believe that votive offerings were simply images of sacred animals, usually given as sacrifices, such as pregnant cows for Demeter, were used as substitutions for animal sacrifice. A stranger category of votive offerings were devotive offerings. These included the ritual sale of slaves to a god in order to free them, portraits of prominent figures given to temples in order to show that they had given their life to the god figuratively, and those who chose to give themselves to the temples as servants to literally give their lives over. That's as close to human sacrifice as we get in ancient Greece, though that's another video topic for later. What does all of this mean for the modern Hellenist? Well, for a start, it means that folks who say you can only give a votive offering if you made it with your own hands are ahistorical, though there are some considerations we might want to make as modern Hellenists around this. However, it means that if you're an artisan or crafter of some sort, you have a lot of different options if you decide you want to give a votive offering. Artists and craftspeople of all sorts get a sort of double benefit here, as creating the offering doubles as a devotional activity, which we'll talk about in part 4. If you feel you've been blessed by a god during a rough time, giving a votive offering to remind yourself and thank them might be in order, especially if you do decide to make it yourself. But please, don't shame anyone who commissions or purchases votives. The ancients did it too. What's most important with a votive is that it means something significant to you with your relationship with a god. I once wrote an article for an org I was part of about collecting and preserving rare shells from the beach for Poseidon, and am currently in the process of designing devotional handwoven lace altar cloth for Athena to commemorate the years that I've spent in the tradition and to thank her for the support that she has given me for my channel and my growth as a person. Seeing that on the altar every day will be a reminder to me of my dedication and oath to her, and that's a lot of what votive offering is about for modern folks. It's a representation of that special relationship you've developed with the gods, as well as the willingness to give valuable and important sacrifices to them as well. Votives, like all other offerings, need to be given with an open mind in thanks or request. Though as we've seen, votives themselves seem to have been given more often in thanksgiving in antiquity rather than as a request. A modern votive offering might look like a small kneaded peplos for a statue of Athena started around Plenteria and Kalenteria, or a new altar cloth or statue for your shrine. It might be a painting or drawing that is symbolic of a special blessing that you received from a particular god, or a written song, or a story, or a play dedicated to them. You might find a particular candle holder or statue that reminds you of them at a store or a garage sale. Or you might have a cherished piece of jewelry or a toy from your childhood that you treasure that feels like a real sacrifice to dedicate to the gods. As far as how to give a votive offering, I would suggest washing the item with carnips if it's the sort you can wash, or in the case of something more sensitive, sprinkle carnips on or around it to help purify it for the altar or shrine space. Present it to the god as you would any other sort of offering, link is in the iCard to my video on prayer and ritual in Hellenism, and then find a place on the altar or shrine to display it. Or take it outside to destroy it, making sure that you either bury the pieces or wrap them to keep them separate from the trash, same as you would for disposing of food offerings or libations poured indoors. Wait, destroy an offering? Votive offerings were left at the temples for the priests to display and dispose of. That means for us, lacking these sacred spaces, if we don't have room for a votive offering on our altars or shrines, shrines, that offering or another previous votive needs to be destroyed so it cannot be used for another purpose other than sacred dedication to the god. Although many forms of this practice can be valid, arguments over whether or not it is historical to use votive offerings in daily life are silly in my view. We don't have a lot of evidence that items dedicated to a god were used outside of the context of the temple, and although you could argue that priests may have used items like furniture or meat given an offering, there really isn't an equivalent to the priestly caste now. Link is in the iCard for my video on the priests of ancient Greece if you're curious about them. Suffice to say that simply practicing daily in your home doesn't necessarily make you a priest within the historical purview. In my opinion, using votive offerings for anything other than display or destruction is ahistorical. Votive offerings can be powerful tools for growth in your relationship with the gods. They stand as a physical reminder of the good that has been done for you by the gods in the roughest of times, and can represent the love and devotion that you feel back for the best of them. A mere glance at the objects on your altar can fill you with awe and gratitude, and remind you that the gods have always been with you. Though we'll never have the experience of crafting or commissioning these sacred things and beholding the sheer volume of others who trekked through the temple to leave theirs there, we can create our own continuous records of our experiences in the modern day, with votives left on our altars and shrines. They're charis made manifest in your space, and that alone is beautiful and special. Choose or create your votive offerings with care, and they will serve both you and the gods for a long time to come. Plus, as I mentioned before, if you decide to make the offering yourself, you can offer the time spent making as the last kind of offering frequently given in ancient times, the devotional offering. Part 4. Devotional Offerings. Devotional activities are an interesting and messy topic, which has come across as strange to me given how big they were in antiquity. Granted, outside of the bardic offering, which I'll go over in a bit, the majority of devotional activities were polis-oriented during festivals, though that doesn't change the fact that dances, plays, poetry, and the process of writing or performing them were all used as offerings in ancient times. Which brings me to the definition of a devotional activity. Put simply, a devotional activity is an activity within the domain or range of interests of a god or goddess that is performed in an intentional and focused way specifically to honor the god or goddess. More often than not, a product of the devotional activity, if it's a craft or art of some kind, is also given as a votive offering when it's done, but many activities such as dancing, performance art, or singing don't actually produce a physical product. In ancient times, devotional activities were not specifically flagged by a particular term, yet we do see countless examples of them throughout history. The plays written and put on at the Dionysia were said to honor Dionysos in his role as the guardian and guide of the theater, and the parade of phalli from the various city-states around Athens prior to these festivities was also said to be in the honor of the god. Great care was taken in both the choices of the authors and the actors made by the heads of the great Greek dames in Athens for this festival, so that neither the play nor the performance would in any way offend the gods. Every aspect of the creation of these plays and their performance was steeped in ritual, as was the act of viewing them by the public. I covered that more in the video that I did on the festival. The link is in the iCard if you'd like to learn more. The feats of strength and athletic prowess at the Panathenaea were said to honor Athena, and the founding heroes of the city as well as Poseidon. Poetic competitions also accompanied this festival and were said to honor the goddess as well as the Mousai. Even the procession presenting the peplos to Athena's statue was wreathed in focus, celebration, and ritual, and the joy arising from that celebration was also treated as its own sort of offering. The festival Heraclea, at the end of July or early August, contained the athletic games and musical contest to honor the dead hero. Even non-citizens were allowed to participate in the feats of strength and endurance required by tradition, which included lifting every one of the 12 bulls sacrificed to the hero onto the altar before slaying them. Although many of these activities clearly had a mythic and traditional significance, it's also clear that the activities themselves were meant to be seen as offerings. The gods were said to delight in the performances of feats of strength, endurance, and artistry for their benefit. The idea that the gods enjoy washing us as a form of entertainment goes all the way back to Homer, where the divine audience gets a special emphasis in the Iliad. As the war goes on and Zeus despairs at his son's dying, he continues to watch despite the pain, and later in the story he continues to watch to amuse himself from Olympus. And this idea of divine amusement translating to charis appears to form the basis of the idea of rhapsodes, or poetic performances, as offerings to the gods in and of themselves. Let's take a look at the structure of one of these hymns, the Homeric hymn to Demeter, to see why that might be in the case of how one could write their own hymns to honor the gods. Now, we're not going to go over the entire hymn line by line, though if you're interested in a video like that, let me know in the comments, as this hymn was the one where we get Persephone's backstory, and her story is one of the mythic videos staring at me angrily in the unfinished pile, still. Like all Homeric hymns, it begins with the nomination of the god being being evoked in the act of speaking with the phrase, I sing. I begin to sing of Demeter, the holy goddess with the beautiful hair, and her daughter Persephone too, the one with the delicate ankles whom Hyades sees. She was given away by Zeus, the loud thunderer, the one who sees far and wide. So we're talking about Demeter and Persephone. Similar to the structure of prayer, which I covered in a previous video on the topic if you missed it, the goddesses are addressed with various epithets and qualities that mark them as distinct from other gods. Demeter's hair is said to be stunning, Persephone has delicate ankles and was given away by Zeus to Hades as a bride according to the ancient Greek custom. I talked about epithets and domains in their own video, link is in the iCard if you missed it, and it's important to note that these names were considered an essential part of the honor given to a god. Some epithets were local, and other Homeric hymns will make reference to these, though the hymn to Demeter has fewer at the beginning than most. The next part of this hymn is known as the narrative, which comprises the bulk of the hymn. This area defines and attributes to the goddesses being praised their time, the part of the mortal lives which belongs to them in their own rights as opposed to other gods. These stories seem to serve a dual function. Through the narratives, we learn what parts of human lives the gods are said to rule over, as well as the ancient mythic reasoning for how we know these things. Keep in mind, this doesn't mean the average Greek literally thought these things happened, despite the protestations of Plato. I covered that in another video as well. Rather, these narratives lay out in excruciating detail for a largely illiterate culture during the time that the poems were written exactly what the poets saw as the domains or interests over which these gods ruled. In this case, through the narrative of Persephone's abduction, we get several qualifications about the gods in question. First, we see Persephone, still as Kore the maiden, as linked to flowers in springtime. She is lured to her capture by Gaia, who grew her a stunning narcissus flower that she couldn't resist. Second, we see that Persephone's link is to young brides, as she is one of the few deities who gets her marriage looked at mythically in any detail. We see this reflected in her cult as well, as young women who died before marriage were seen as passing into her care in the underworld, never having fulfilled their duty, and certain rites of passage prior to wedding young women were carried out to honor Persephone. Finally, her place as queen of the underworld and thereby caretaker of the house of Hades is established by her marriage in the narrative, which entitles her to offerings during Greek burial rites, as well as where the ancients honored their ancestors. For more on honoring the ancestors in Hellenism, link is in the iCard above the topic. Demeter, we learn, rules over the seeds and their sprouts, as when she discovers Persephone missing, she causes the seeds to remain buried under the earth and thereby the plowing of the oxen to remain in vain. We also discover her epithet as bringer of the Horai, or the seasons, over which she is said to rule. Even Zeus can't force her to do her job to continue the cycles of the goddess between the gods and humankind in her grief, and is forced to make a compromise with Hades in order to bring the seasons back. At one point in the narrative, we also get to the origin of the Temple of Eleusis and the Eleusinian mysteries themselves. Demeter's displeasure at her treatment in disguise by a mortal whose child she takes care of leads her to demanding the temple and teaching the mysteries to please her and her daughter to the members of the household so that they don't displease her like that again. Recounting the story is the poet's acknowledgement for the audience of the divine right of these deities to their particular realms, especially when you consider that this particular hymn, the ruler of the gods himself, is said to be unable to force her to cause the seeds to sprout and the seasons to shift, meaning that even with his power, he still cannot take her time from her. She actually has a special epithet acknowledging this, Antaia, which means hostile or antagonistic, referring to when she defied Zeus and starved humans out of concern for her daughter. At the end, we get confirmation recounting these stories was seen as an offering in the final lines of the poem. But come, you goddesses who have charge of the Deimos of Eleusis, fragment with incense, and the Paros, the rocky island of Antron. Come, O lady resplendent with gifts, Queen Deo, bringer of the Horai, both you and your daughter, the most beautiful Persephone, think kindly and grant in return for this song a rich means of livelihood that suits the thumos, and I will keep you in my mind throughout the rest of my song. In return for this song implies the poets believed their songs to be offerings, and given how the major festivals often included poetic recitation competitions of the Homeric hymns, as well as earlier established performances of new works of comedy and tragedy, it makes sense that it would be. Honoring the gods through the careful recitation of poetry, which required the poet to learn an entire special dialect of ancient Greek that was used exclusively for said poetry, as well as the specific governing rules around the composition of verse, took quite a bit of effort and training to do properly. In the same way the gods were said to enjoy the scent of burnt offerings, which I covered in part 2, they enjoyed performances specifically meant to continue and confer honor upon them. This isn't the only reference to poetic performance as offerings, even outside of the festivals either. In the Iliad, the Achaeans attempted to propitiate the god Apollon over the debacle regarding Chryses. So the whole day long they thought to appease the god with song, singing the beautiful Bian, the sons of the Achaeans, hymning to the god who works from afar, and his heart was glad as he heard. And in Hesiod's Theogony, he mentions the muses telling telling him to sing always of them first and last, similar to the offerings given to Hestia for providing the link between the gods and humans through the sacred hearth fire for traditional offerings. So we have the performance and compositions of plays and poems, feats of great strength and athletic prowess, dances performed at festivals, and the crafting of ritual objects, all of which were seen as offerings to the gods. 4 out of 5 of these produce no physical benefit, as the performance doesn't even need to be in front of other humans to be considered an offering, as we see in the Homeric hymn for Aphrodite, when the goddess approaches Anchises as he sings and hymns alone with his lyre. The acts themselves are seen as the offering because they're done with the expressed purpose of honoring the gods. That doesn't necessarily mean anything done because of worship of a particular god is a devotional offering, however. Running into a burning building to save a child is a noble act of virtue regardless, but even if it's done to honor what are seen as the qualities embodied by gods like Dike and Zeus, it's not quite the same thing. The quality of all devotional offering examples we've seen from antiquity that they share regards the deliberateness of the act. Singing and performing plays, hymns, and poems requires immense training and concentration, and to mess up would mar the experience for the god. The whole focus of the performer has to be on the act. Likewise, crafting a ritual or offering object for a god, or crafting in general while asking for the god's aid to honor them. The mindset is key here. Though your intention might be to honor Zeus's justice, the fact remains that the sort of concentration required to give the god honor might be impossible while running into a burning building, or while surrounded by distractions in daily life. So, if you want to give a devotional offering to the gods, it's best to treat it with the reverence of anything else you would do in ritual. Set aside time as free of distractions as you can, and say a prayer honoring the god before you start. I'd even suggest cleansing yourself of miasma, link in the iCard if you're not sure how to do this as a Hellenist. Put your whole self into the act, keeping the god you intend to honor in mind through the whole process. The sort of activity is best either as a performance, as mentioned, or something from within that god's domain. Smithing is a good example for Hephaestus or Athena, the writing for the Musai or crafting of music for Apollon, knitting, sewing, weaving, pottery, or other visual arts for Athena, athletic training for Heracles, or military exercises for Ares, etc. The key is making sure that you are making it clear to the god and yourself that what you are doing is for them. It's a sacred act and it's important to treat it as one. One last note before we wrap up. As mentioned in the introduction, there are numerous modern offerings and ways of offerings that you could do in addition to the historical examples given. I, for example, frequently give gluten-free honey cakes because both my husband and I have celiac disease, and thereby I can't handle wheat, gluten, or barley without severe illness. I've met some folks who offer soda to the gods and say it works for them, and numerous people have brought up offerings and rituals performed in virtual spaces as meaningful to them. While I can't attest to the efficacy of any of these practices beyond my own example, what I can say is that these traditions would have evolved and changed with the times had they fully survived, and if you're concerned about a practice or offering, divination is always an option to confirm that the gods are okay with it. I hope the examples given here showcased the sheer breadth and creativity of offerings to the gods in ancient times and helped inspire you in your own practice. Offering and prayer are the core of charis, the primary way in which we interact with the gods and show our devotion and build our relationships. May your offerings to the Theoi always be received with kind heart by the gods. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, cut open the subscribe button and examine the likes entrails to see if they please the almighty algorithm. Drop down into the comments and let me know if any of the examples inspired you, or tell us what you've offered lately if you're so inclined. There might be some interesting examples for folks to take inspiration from in your practice. Special thanks also to my patrons. Resources get so expensive so quickly, and as you know, it can take a bit of extra interpretation from scholars to really understand some of the concepts that we look at here on the channel. Without the support that I receive from folks scrolling by on this list, I wouldn't be able to do what I do here on the channel. If you'd like to help contribute, link is in the description to both my Patreon, or if you'd like to just do a small one-time donation, both the channel wish list and my Ko-Fi. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.